Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the Dutch Golden Age. A small nation rules the seas. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. In the year 1600, the 7 small provinces of the Dutch Republic occupied a sliver of waterlogged land along the North Sea coast of Europe, a territory so flat and so low that much of it lay below the level of the tides. It was a country of polders and windmills, of canals and dikes, of grey skies and wide horizons, a place where the boundary between land and water had never been entirely certain. And yet this improbable nation, smaller than many of the counties of its neighbours, with a population of barely 1.5 million souls, was about to enter a century of such extraordinary wealth, power, and cultural brilliance that historians would call it a golden age. For 100 years, from roughly 1600 to 1700, the Dutch Republic would dominate global trade, produce some of the greatest art in human history, pioneer new systems of finance and governance, and project its influence across every ocean on Earth. It is one of the most remarkable stories of the early modern world, the story of how a small nation of merchants, sailors, and engineers came to rule the seas. The roots of Dutch prosperity lay in water itself. For centuries, the people of the Low Countries had fought an endless war against the sea, building dikes to hold back the tides, draining marshes to create farmland, constructing elaborate systems of canals and pumping stations powered by the wind. This constant struggle had created a society of extraordinary practical ingenuity. The Dutch were engineers by necessity, problem solvers by temperament, and cooperators by survival. No single landowner could maintain a dike alone. No individual village could drain a polder without the help of its neighbors. The water boards that governed drainage and flood control were among the oldest democratic institutions in Europe, requiring consensus, shared investment, and collective responsibility on a scale that feudal societies elsewhere could scarcely imagine. This practical, cooperative spirit extended naturally into commerce. The Dutch had been traders since the Middle Ages, when the herring fisheries of the North Sea first brought wealth to the coastal towns of Holland and Zeeland. Dutch fishermen developed a technique of gutting and salting herring at sea, aboard their ships, which allowed them to stay out longer and bring back larger catches. This simple innovation, credited to a 14th-century fisherman named Willem Beukelsen, gave the Dutch a decisive advantage in the herring trade and generated the capital that would later fuel their expansion into global commerce. The herring, it was said, was the foundation upon which Amsterdam was built. The herring trade led naturally to the Baltic trade, which became the second pillar of Dutch commercial power. Every year, hundreds of Dutch ships sailed through the Danish Sound into the Baltic Sea, carrying salt, cloth, and manufactured goods eastward, and returning with the raw materials that Northern Europe produced in abundance: grain from Poland, timber from Scandinavia, furs from Russia, flax and hemp for rope and sailcloth. By the late 16th century, the Dutch controlled over 70% of Baltic shipping, a dominance so complete that they called the Baltic their modernegety, their mother trade, the foundation upon which all their other commerce rested. The grain trade alone was enormously important. The Dutch provinces could not feed their growing population from their own limited farmland, so they imported vast quantities of rye and wheat from the great estates of Poland and Prussia, shipped down the Vistula to the port of Danzig and thence across the North Sea to Amsterdam. This grain fed the urban population and freed Dutch farmers to concentrate on more profitable products, dairy, vegetables, industrial crops like flax and rapeseed, and the tulips and other flowers that would become both a famous industry and an infamous speculation. The Dutch countryside was not a subsistence landscape but a commercial one, integrated into a trading network that stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. But the true catalyst for Dutch maritime power was political. In 1568, the provinces of the Low Countries, then under the rule of the Spanish Habsburgs, revolted against the autocratic religious policies of King Philip II of Spain. The Dutch Revolt, or 80 Years' War, would last from 1568 to 1648, but by the 1590s, the northern provinces had effectively secured their independence. The war had been fought not by great armies on open battlefields but by siege warfare, naval engagements, and the strategic flooding of polders to halt advancing Spanish troops. It was a war of endurance, of clever engineering, and of commerce, for the Dutch continued to trade even while they fought, using their profits to finance their resistance. The revolt transformed the Dutch Republic into something unique in European history. It was not a monarchy but a federation of sovereign provinces, governed by a complex system of representative assemblies called the States General. It had no king, no established church with coercive powers, and no hereditary aristocracy that controlled the levers of government. Power lay instead with the merchant class, the regents and burghers of the great trading cities, men who valued profit, pragmatism, and religious tolerance above all else. This tolerance was not idealistic in origin but commercial. The Dutch understood that persecuting people for their beliefs was bad for business. Refugees from religious persecution across Europe, Flemish Protestants, Portuguese Jews, French Huguenots, brought skills, capital, and trading connections to the Republic. Amsterdam became the most cosmopolitan city in Europe, a place where a dozen languages could be heard on any given street, where synagogues stood near churches, and where the exchange of ideas was as free as the exchange of goods. The war with Spain had another consequence that proved decisive for Dutch expansion. In 1585, when the Spanish army under the Duke of Parma captured the great port city of Antwerp, they closed the river Scheldt to commerce, strangling the trade that had made Antwerp the commercial capital of northern Europe. Tens of thousands of merchants, artisans, and skilled workers fled north to Amsterdam, bringing with them their capital, their expertise, and their trading networks. It was one of the great transfers of human talent in European history. Diamond cutters, sugar refiners, cloth merchants, printers, cartographers, and financiers all made the journey north, transforming Amsterdam from a prosperous regional center into a world city within a single generation. The refugees brought not only skills but ambition. Among them were merchants who had traded with the Portuguese colonies in Asia and Africa, men who knew the routes, the ports, the prices, and the products of the spice trade. When Philip II closed Lisbon to Dutch ships in 1580, cutting off their access to Asian goods, these merchants saw not a crisis but an opportunity. If they could not buy spices through intermediaries, they would go directly to the source. In 1595, the first Dutch fleet set sail for the East Indies, for ships under the command of Cornelis de Houtman, rounding the Cape of Good Hope and reaching the spice markets of Java after a voyage of 14 months. The expedition was a commercial failure and nearly half the crew died, but it proved the route was viable. Within 5 years, over 60 Dutch ships had made the voyage to Asia. The engine of Dutch global power was the ship. Dutch shipbuilders, working in the great yards along the Zaan River north of Amsterdam, developed a series of innovations that gave their vessels decisive advantages over those of other nations. The most important was the Fluit, a cargo ship first built around 1595 that revolutionized maritime commerce. The Fluit was designed purely for carrying goods, with a wide belly, a flat bottom, and a narrow deck. Its hull shape maximized cargo capacity while minimizing the deck area on which port taxes were calculated. It required a smaller crew than comparable vessels of other nations, typically about a dozen men for a ship that could carry several hundred tons of cargo. It was cheaper to build, cheaper to operate, and could carry more goods per sailor than any ship that had come before. The Dutch built these ships in enormous numbers, using standardized designs and semi-industrial production methods that presaged the assembly lines of later centuries. Timber was brought from the Baltic. Rope was imported from Russia. Sails were woven in the textile towns of Holland. The components were produced in specialized workshops and assembled in the yards with a speed and efficiency that astonished foreign observers. By 1670, the Dutch merchant fleet numbered perhaps 15,000 vessels, more than the combined fleets of England, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. It was said that the Dutch had more ships than all the rest of Europe put together. The Zaan district alone, a stretch of river barely 15 miles long, contained over 600 industrial windmills and dozens of shipyards that could produce a complete ocean-going vessel in a matter of weeks. The sound of sawing timber and hammering mallets carried across the flat landscape day and night. The smell of tar and fresh-cut oak hung in the air. It was an industrial landscape of a kind that had never existed before, a concentrated zone of manufacturing that anticipated the factory districts of the Industrial Revolution by nearly 2 centuries. In 1602, the merchants of the Republic took a step that would reshape the world economy for centuries to come. They founded the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, the Dutch East India Company, known by its initials as the VOC. It was the first true multinational corporation, the first company to issue shares of stock to public investors, and for nearly 200 years it would be the largest and most powerful commercial enterprise on earth. The Dutch government granted the VOC a monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, along with the authority to negotiate treaties, build forts, maintain armies, and administer justice in territories it controlled. It was, in effect, a state within a state, a commercial empire with its own navy, its own soldiers, and its own governors. The VOC's initial capital was enormous by the standards of the age, 6.5 million guilders, subscribed by over 1,000 investors from every level of Dutch society. Merchants invested the largest sums, but shopkeepers, artisans, servants, and even a few orphanages contributed as well. The shares were freely tradable, creating the first secondary market in corporate securities. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, housed in a purpose-built courtyard where traders gathered every day between noon and 2 o'clock, became the center of this new form of finance. It was here that the mechanisms of modern capitalism were invented and refined: options, futures, short selling, margin trading, and all the other instruments that would later define the world's financial markets. The VOC's ambitions were vast. Its ships sailed to the Spice Islands of the Malay Archipelago, what is now Indonesia, to monopolize the trade in nutmeg, cloves, mace, and pepper. These spices, so common today, were among the most valuable substances in the 17th century world. Nutmeg was worth more than its weight in gold. Pepper was used as currency. Cloves were believed to have medicinal properties that could cure any ailment. The VOC pursued these treasures with a ruthlessness that matched its ambition. It drove Portuguese competitors from the region, established fortified trading posts across Southeast Asia, and ultimately imposed a near-total monopoly on the spice trade that generated profits of several 100% on every voyage. The methods employed to secure this monopoly were often brutal. In the Banda Islands, the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally, the VOC's Governor-General Jan Pietersoen Cohen ordered the near-complete depopulation of the islands in 1621, killing or enslaving most of the indigenous inhabitants and replacing them with Dutch planters who worked enslaved labor to cultivate the trees. It was an act of calculated violence that secured the nutmeg monopoly but stained Dutch commercial history with a cruelty that cannot be forgotten or excused. The spice trade brought immense wealth to the Republic, but it was built, in significant measure, upon exploitation and coercion in the lands from which those spices came. At its peak, the VOC employed over 50,000 people, operated a fleet of nearly 200 ocean-going vessels, and maintained a network of trading posts, factories, and colonies that stretched from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan. Its headquarters in the east was the city of Batavia, built on the site of modern Jakarta, a tropical Dutch town of canals and gabled houses where European merchants traded silk, porcelain, and tea with Chinese, Japanese, Malay, and Indian partners. The VOC was the only European power permitted to trade with Japan during its 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation, maintaining a tiny trading post on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor, a single window through which Japanese goods flowed to the markets of Europe. The return fleet from Batavia was one of the great spectacles of the maritime world. Each year, a convoy of heavily laden ships would depart the East Indies for the 8-month voyage home, their holds packed with pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, Chinese porcelain, Japanese lacquerware, Indian cotton textiles, and Ceylon tea. The fleet would round the Cape of Good Hope, where the VOC had established a permanent settlement in 1652 to provision passing ships, and then sail north through the Atlantic to the home ports of Amsterdam, Middelburg, and Rotterdam. The arrival of the return fleet was an event of national importance, anticipated for weeks, celebrated when it appeared on the horizon, and immediately followed by auctions at the VOC's warehouses where merchants bid for the cargoes that would supply the markets of Europe. But the East Indies were not the only theatre of Dutch commercial ambition. In 1621, the Republic founded the West India Company, the WIC, which operated in the Atlantic world. The WIC established colonies in Brazil, captured sugar plantations in the Caribbean, founded the settlement of New Amsterdam on the tip of Manhattan Island, and traded along the coast of West Africa. Dutch ships carried enslaved Africans across the Atlantic in numbers that, while smaller than those of Portugal or later Britain, nonetheless made the Republic complicit in one of history's greatest crimes. The wealth that built the canal houses of Amsterdam was not won by commerce alone but by the systematic exploitation of human beings on 3 continents. In Brazil, the WIC under its governor Johan Moritz van Nassau briefly controlled a vast territory stretching along the northeastern coast, including the valuable sugar-producing regions of Pernambuco and Bahia. Johan Moritz was an unusual colonial administrator, a patron of the arts who brought painters, scientists, and architects to document and develop the colony. But the Dutch hold on Brazil lasted only from 1630 to 1654, when a Portuguese revolt drove them out. New Amsterdam fared little better as a Dutch possession, surrendered to the English in 1664 and renamed New York. The WIC never achieved the sustained profitability of the VOC, but its operations demonstrated the global reach of Dutch commercial ambition. Amsterdam itself was transformed by this wealth into one of the great cities of the world. Its population grew from perhaps 50,000 in 1600 to over 200,000 by 1660, making it the 3rd or 4th largest city in Europe. The city expanded outward in a series of concentric canals, the famous Grachtengordel, each one wider and more elegant than the last. The Heringgracht, the Keizersgracht, and the Prinsengracht were lined with the grand houses of the merchant elite, tall narrow buildings of brick and stone with ornamental gables and large windows that let in the pale northern light. Behind these facades lay rooms furnished with the treasures of global trade, Chinese porcelain on the mantelpiece, Persian carpets on the table, paintings by the finest Dutch masters on the walls, and in the kitchen, spices from half the world flavoring the evening meal. The canal ring was not merely functional but beautiful, a planned urban environment designed to accommodate both commerce and gracious living. The canals served as roads for the flat-bottomed boats that carried goods to and from the warehouses. The elm trees that lined their banks provided shade in summer and a gentle green canopy that softened the hard lines of brick and stone. The bridges, over 1,000 of them, arched gracefully over the dark water, connecting one street to the next in a network of such complexity that visitors often lost their way. At night, the houses were lit from within, their large uncurtained windows glowing with candlelight, and their reflections rippling on the water below like paintings that had been gently shaken. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609, became the clearinghouse for international trade, its deposits guaranteed by the city government, its bills of exchange accepted in every port from Lisbon to Nagasaki. The bank did not lend money or pay interest on deposits. Its purpose was simpler and more revolutionary, to provide a stable, trustworthy medium of exchange in a world of debased and uncertain coinages. Merchants from any nation could deposit coins of any origin and receive credit in bank guilders, a unit of account whose value was guaranteed. This apparently modest innovation transformed international trade by eliminating the uncertainty and transaction costs that had plagued commerce for centuries. A bill drawn on the Amsterdam Exchange Bank was as good as gold anywhere in the known world. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the first in the world to trade company shares continuously, was established in a purpose-built building in 1611. Here merchants and speculators bought and sold shares in the VOC and WIC, creating the first financial markets in the modern sense. The Dutch invented futures contracts, options, short selling, and many of the other instruments that would later define global capitalism. They also experienced the first great financial bubble, the famous tulip mania of 1637, when speculation in rare tulip bulbs drove prices to absurd heights before the market collapsed. At the peak of the mania, a single bulb of the Semper Augustus variety, with its distinctive red and white striped petals, sold for a price that could have bought a fine house on the Amsterdam canals. Weavers, blacksmiths, and farmers abandoned their trades to speculate in bulbs they never intended to plant. Fortunes were made and lost in the taverns where informal trading took place, futures contracts changing hands dozens of times before the bulbs even left the ground. When the crash came in February 1637, it was sudden and merciless. Prices fell by over 90% within weeks. The episode became a cautionary tale that has echoed through every subsequent financial crisis, a reminder that markets driven by pure speculation can depart very far from any rational assessment of value. The wealth that flowed through Amsterdam funded an extraordinary flowering of art and science. The Dutch Golden Age produced painters of such genius that their work continues to define our understanding of what painting can achieve. Rembrandt van Rijn, working in his studio on the Jodenbriestraat in Amsterdam, created portraits of such psychological depth that they seem to look back at the viewer across for centuries. His early years were marked by spectacular success. By his mid-20s he was the most sought-after portrait painter in Amsterdam, commanding fees that made him wealthy and allowing him to collect art, antiquities, and curiosities with a passion that sometimes bordered on extravagance. His masterpiece, The Night Watch, completed in 1642, transformed the group portrait from a static record into a drama of light and movement. The enormous canvas, over 12 feet wide, depicts the militia company of Captain Franz Banning-Cocq emerging from shadow into golden light, their figures arranged not in the conventional static rows but in a burst of action and energy that was unprecedented in Dutch art. It remains one of the most famous paintings in the world, a work that demonstrates Rembrandt's ability to combine documentary accuracy with theatrical imagination on a monumental scale. But it is Rembrandt's later work that most deeply moves us today. After financial difficulties forced him into bankruptcy in 1656, his painting became quieter, deeper, more inward. The late self-portraits, painted in the decade before his death in 1669, show a face marked by time and suffering but illuminated by an undiminished intelligence and a hard-won compassion. They are among the most honest images ever committed to canvas, works in which the painter confronts his own mortality without flinching and finds in that confrontation something that is not despair but understanding. Johannes Vermeer, working quietly in the city of Delft, produced fewer than 40 paintings in his entire career, each one a small miracle of light and stillness. His interiors, showing women reading letters, pouring milk, or playing musical instruments in rooms suffused with cool northern daylight, capture something essential about the texture of daily life in the Dutch Republic. The light in a Vermeer painting seems to have weight and substance, falling through leaded glass windows and illuminating ordinary objects with a radiance that borders on the sacred. A loaf of bread, a blue ceramic jug, the brass studs of a leather chair, all are rendered with such loving attention that they seem to glow from within. Vermeer's world is one of perfect stillness, of moments suspended outside of time. The woman reading a letter by the window does not notice us. The girl with the pearl earring turns toward us with a look of such enigmatic beauty that viewers have spent centuries trying to read her expression. The maid pouring milk from a heavy earthenware jug concentrates wholly on her task, the thin stream of white catching the light as it falls. These are not grand historical scenes or religious allegories. They are moments of ordinary domestic life, elevated by the painter's eye into something that approaches the sublime. It was an art that celebrated the domestic, the everyday, the modest pleasures of a prosperous and orderly society, and it speaks to us still with a quiet power that time has not diminished. But it was not only Rembrandt and Vermeer. The Dutch Republic supported hundreds of professional painters working in every genre. Jacob van Ruisdael painted landscapes that captured the vast skies and flat horizons of the Dutch countryside, with towering clouds that dwarf the tiny figures below and shafts of sunlight breaking through overcast heavens to illuminate a distant windmill or church tower. His paintings evoke the particular quality of Dutch light, that silvery luminosity that results from the constant proximity of water and the high latitude of the northern sky. Willem van der Velde the Younger recorded the ships of the Dutch fleet with such precision that naval historians still use his paintings as technical references. Every rope, every sail, every pennant is rendered with the accuracy of an engineer's drawing, yet the overall effect is one of beauty rather than documentation. His sea battles rage across enormous canvases, smoke and spray mingling in the air as men of war exchange broadsides on grey northern seas. His calmer scenes show Dutch harbours at peace, the merchant fleet riding at anchor, their hulls reflected in still water, their masts a forest of vertical lines against the pale sky. Still life painters like Willem Cuyp and Abraham van Buren arranged the products of global trade into compositions of astonishing richness. A typical Cuyp painting might show a Chinese porcelain bowl, a half-peeled lemon with its rind curling in a spiral, a Venetian glass goblet filled with white wine, a silver platter bearing a slice of pie, all set against a dark background that makes the objects seem to glow. These paintings were meditations on beauty and transience, celebrations of material abundance that simultaneously reminded the viewer of its impermanence. The lemon will rot. The wine will sour. The glass will break. But the painting endures, preserving a moment of perfect arrangement against the entropy of time. The sciences flourished equally. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a draper from Delft with no formal scientific training, ground his own lenses with such precision that he became the first human being to observe bacteria, protozoa, and spermatozoa. His microscopes were tiny handheld instruments, single lenses of extraordinary quality mounted between two small plates of brass. He refused to sell them or reveal his methods of grinding, but the observations he sent to the Royal Society in London, accompanied by meticulous drawings, opened a world that no one had imagined existed. He described the creatures he saw in a drop of pond water with wonder and precision, calling them animalcules, little animals, and noting their extraordinary diversity of form and movement. It was perhaps the most consequential act of amateur science in history. Christian Huygens, son of the prominent diplomat and poet Constantijn Huygens, made fundamental contributions to mathematics, physics, and astronomy. He discovered the true nature of Saturn's rings, which earlier telescopes had shown only as vague appendages. He identified Titan, Saturn's largest moon. He invented the pendulum clock in 1656, the first timepiece accurate enough for scientific measurement, and developed the wave theory of light in opposition to Newton's corpuscular theory. His work on probability theory, the physics of colliding bodies, and the mathematics of curves placed him among the greatest scientists of the 17th century, second only to Newton himself. The universities of Leiden and Utrecht attracted scholars from across Europe. Leiden, founded in 1575 as a reward for the city's heroic resistance during a Spanish siege, became one of the foremost centers of learning in Europe. Its anatomy theater, botanical garden, and observatory drew students from every nation. Its professors included some of the leading minds of the age in medicine, law, theology, and the natural sciences. The university's motto, Praesidium Libertatis, Bastion of Liberty, reflected the Dutch belief that freedom of inquiry was essential to intellectual progress. The Dutch also pioneered new ideas about governance and society that would echo through later centuries. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza, a Portuguese Jew born in Amsterdam in 1632, developed a system of thought that challenged the foundations of traditional religion and politics. Excommunicated from the Jewish community at the age of 23 for his heterodox views, Spinoza supported himself by grinding lenses while producing philosophical works of extraordinary depth and originality. His Ethics, written in the geometric style of mathematical proofs, argued that God and nature were one and the same, that free will was an illusion, and that human happiness lay in the intellectual understanding of necessity. His theological political treatise, published anonymously in 1670, argued for the separation of philosophy from theology and defended freedom of thought as essential to a stable republic. Hugo Grotius, the great jurist, laid the foundations of international law in his work on the Law of War and Peace, published in 1625. Grotius argued that natural law, accessible to human reason regardless of divine revelation, could provide a framework for regulating relations between states. He established principles of just war, the rights of neutrals, the treatment of prisoners, and the freedom of the seas that remain foundational to international law today. The concept of mare liberum, the freedom of the seas, was a Dutch invention, born of the practical need to justify their trading activities against Portuguese and Spanish claims of oceanic monopoly. It became one of the most influential legal principles in history, the basis for the modern law of the sea. Religious tolerance, imperfect as it was, set the Dutch Republic apart from every other state in Europe. The official church was the Dutch Reformed Church, Calvinist in theology and austere in practice. But while Catholics were not permitted to worship publicly, they were not persecuted, and their private chapels, known as Schuilkerken or hidden churches, operated openly in every city. One such church, hidden behind a canal house facade on the Uitzicht-Burgwal in Amsterdam, was so large that it could accommodate several hundred worshippers. Everyone knew it was there. No one was arrested for attending. Jews lived freely in the Republic, worshipped openly in magnificent synagogues, and participated fully in economic life. The Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, completed in 1675, was one of the largest and most beautiful houses of worship in Europe, its great interior lit by hundreds of candles reflected in brass chandeliers. Sephardic Jews from Portugal and Spain and Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe found in Amsterdam a haven from the persecution they suffered elsewhere. They became merchants, doctors, printers, philosophers, and artists, contributing to the intellectual and commercial life of the Republic in proportion far beyond their numbers. Dissenting Protestant sects that would have been burned at the stake elsewhere found shelter in Dutch cities. Mennonites, Remonstrants, Quakers, and countless other groups practiced their faith without interference. The Pilgrim Fathers, before they sailed for America aboard the Mayflower in 1620, lived for more than a decade in Leiden, where they enjoyed a freedom of worship they could not find in England. This tolerance was the foundation of Dutch prosperity, for it attracted talent and capital from across the continent and created a society of remarkable intellectual and cultural diversity. The physical landscape of the Republic reflected its prosperity in every particular. Travelers from other countries remarked with astonishment on the extraordinary cleanliness of Dutch cities, on streets that were scrubbed and swept daily, on windows polished to a shine, on the absence of the mud and refuse that characterized other European capitals. The Dutch obsession with cleanliness was legendary and perhaps understandable in a land where water was everywhere and contamination a constant threat. But it extended to an aesthetic sensibility as well. The interiors painted by Vermeer and Peter de Hooch were not idealized fantasies but relatively accurate records of how prosperous Dutch families actually lived, in rooms of quiet order and modest elegance, where every object had its place and every surface reflected the careful attention of its owner. The countryside was equally remarkable. Travelers noted the fertility of the reclaimed polders, the orderliness of the farms, the fat cattle grazing on green meadows that had been seabed a generation earlier. Dutch agriculture was the most productive in Europe, using techniques of crop rotation, selective breeding, and land management that would not become common elsewhere for another century or more. The black and white Frisian cattle that grazed the polders were the product of centuries of careful breeding, their milk yielding the butter and cheese that were among the Republic's most important exports. Edam, Gouda, and Leyden cheese traveled the world in Dutch ships, appearing on tables from Moscow to Batavia. The windmills that dotted the landscape served 100 purposes: grinding grain, sawing timber, pressing oil from seeds, fulling cloth, and above all, pumping water from the polders to keep the land dry. They were the machines of a mechanical civilization, the engines of an economy that had learned to extract wealth from the most unpromising of landscapes. At the height of the Golden Age, there were over 9,000 windmills operating in the Dutch Republic, their great sails turning day and night in the constant North Sea wind, a forest of slowly rotating crosses visible from every point on the flat horizon. But no golden age lasts forever. By the 1670s, the Republic faced challenges that would gradually erode its position of dominance. In 1672, the year the Dutch called the Rampjaar, the disaster year, the Republic was simultaneously invaded by France, England, and the German principalities of Munster and Cologne. The French army of Louis XIV, the most powerful military force in Europe, over 100,000 men strong, swept across the eastern provinces with terrifying speed. City after city fell. Utrecht was occupied. The road to Amsterdam lay open. Only the desperate measure of opening the sluices and flooding the polders stopped the French advance short of the capital. The Dutch water line, a defensive barrier created by deliberately inundating a strip of land stretching from the Zuider Zee to the great rivers, turned the heart of Holland into an island that the French cavalry could not cross. It was a sacrifice of extraordinary magnitude, the deliberate destruction of farmland that had taken generations to reclaim from the sea, but it saved the Republic. The crisis also brought to power the young stadtholder William III of Orange, whose determination and diplomatic skill would eventually assemble a European coalition against Louis and fight France to a standstill. The Republic survived the ramp jar, but at enormous cost in wealth, confidence, and territory. The war revealed the fundamental vulnerability of a small trading nation surrounded by larger and more populous neighbors who could simply overwhelm it with numbers. England, under successive Stuart and later Hanoverian monarchs, systematically copied Dutch commercial and financial innovations while building a navy capable of challenging Dutch maritime supremacy. The three Anglo-Dutch Wars of 1652 to 1674 had already demonstrated that English sea power was growing rapidly. The Navigation Acts, which restricted trade with English colonies to English ships, struck directly at Dutch commercial interests. Gradually, over the last decades of the 17th century and into the 18th, the center of maritime power shifted across the North Sea. London replaced Amsterdam as the financial capital of Europe. The English East India Company overtook the VOC. The Royal Navy grew to surpass the Dutch fleet in size and capability. The irony was that it was a Dutchman who accelerated this transfer of power. When William III of Orange accepted the English crown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, he brought with him Dutch financial expertise, Dutch military methods, and Dutch capital. The Bank of England, founded in 1694 on the model of the Amsterdam Exchange Bank, became the instrument through which English, and later British, commercial power was financed. Dutch investors poured money into English government bonds and trading companies. The pupil was learning from the master, and would soon surpass him. The decline of the Dutch Republic was not sudden or catastrophic. It remained wealthy and influential well into the 18th century. Dutch banks continued to finance European commerce. Dutch artists continued to produce remarkable work. Dutch scientists continued to make important discoveries. The great canal houses of Amsterdam remained elegant and well-maintained. The universities continued to attract foreign students. The standard of living remained among the highest in Europe. But the extraordinary dynamism of the Golden Age, that restless creative energy that had built a global empire from a patch of soggy land below sea level, gradually faded into a more comfortable, more conservative prosperity. The regents of the great cities became an entrenched oligarchy, passing offices from father to son, more concerned with maintaining their position than with pursuing new opportunities. The adventurous spirit that had sent ships to every corner of the earth was replaced by a preference for the safe returns of government bonds and foreign loans. The Republic did not fall. It simply ceased to lead. The torch of maritime and commercial supremacy passed to Britain, which would hold it for the next 2 centuries, building upon foundations that the Dutch had laid. And yet the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age is woven into the fabric of the modern world in ways both visible and invisible. The global financial system, with its stock exchanges, central banks, and paper currencies, traces its origins to 17th century Amsterdam. The principle of freedom of the seas, which governs international maritime law to this day, was first articulated by Dutch jurists. The tradition of religious tolerance and freedom of thought that defines liberal democracy was nurtured in Dutch cities when it could find no home elsewhere. And the paintings of Rembrandt and Vermeer, those quiet masterpieces of light and shadow, continue to speak across the centuries with an intimacy and honesty that time cannot diminish. Let yourself drift now with the rhythms of the old Dutch world. Imagine the gentle rocking of a fluid at anchor in some distant harbor, its holds filled with the treasures of the East. The timber of its hull creaks softly with the movement of the water, a sound so familiar to the sleeping crew that they do not hear it, as natural and as constant as their own breathing. The ropes hum faintly in the night breeze, and the lantern at the stern swings slowly, casting a pool of amber light that moves back and forth across the dark water below. Imagine the quiet of a canal house in the early evening, the light fading from the tall windows, the day's commerce concluded, the household settling into the peace of nightfall. The heavy curtains are not yet drawn, and through the glass you can see the canal below, its surface smooth and still as polished ebony, reflecting the gabled rooflines and the deepening sky above. A maid moves softly through the room, lighting candles one by one, each small flame adding its warmth to the gathering dusk. The smell of fresh bread rises from the kitchen below, mixing with the faint sweetness of beeswax and the distant scent of tobacco from the master's pipe. Imagine the sound of water lapping against stone, the creak of ships at their moorings, the distant chime of the Westerkerk bell marking the hour across the sleeping city. The canals of Amsterdam stretch before you in the gathering darkness, their surfaces smooth and dark as polished glass, reflecting the gabled houses and the pale stars appearing one by one in the vast sky above. A single boat passes, its oars dipping quietly into the black water, leaving ripples that spread in perfect circles and fade and are still. The oarsman does not hurry. There is nowhere to be at this hour but home, and home is near, always near in a city built upon the water. Somewhere a harpsichord is being played, a slow and tender melody that carries across the canal on the still night air. The notes fall like drops of water, one after another, unhurried and precise, each one fading to silence before the next begins. It is a piece by Sweelinck perhaps, or one of the English composers whose work was popular in Dutch drawing rooms, a music of gentle melancholy and quiet beauty perfectly suited to the hour. And in this stillness, in this gentle fading of the golden light, let the stories of ships and spices, of paintings and prophets, of that improbable little nation that once commanded the world's commerce, carry you softly toward sleep. The Dutch understood something essential about the relationship between effort and rest, between the long day's work and the deep night's peace. They built their world with patience and ingenuity, and they enjoyed its comforts with a quiet satisfaction that needed no ostentation. Their paintings celebrate not grandeur but intimacy, not power but the gentle pleasures of light falling through a window onto a table where a glass of wine catches the last warmth of the dying afternoon. Let that same spirit of calm contentment settle over you now. The day is done. The ships are in harbor. The warehouses are locked, their great doors closed against the night. The merchants have returned to their homes along the canals, the ledgers are closed, the profits counted, the letters sealed and set aside for tomorrow's post. The city is settling into its evening hush, and the wide Dutch sky is darkening toward night, the stars appearing one by one above the rooftops like the slow lighting of distant candles, gentle and constant and infinitely far away. Let sleep come as it comes to a harbor at evening, gradually and without force, the sounds of the world growing softer, more distant, more dreamlike, until all that remains is the faint lapping of water against ancient stone, the barely perceptible creak of timber, and the vast quiet of the night spreading across the low flat land like a blanket drawn gently over a sleeping world.